Good morning, Happy Valley, and welcome back to another edition of the Penn State 365 podcast. As always, I'm your host, Richie O'Leary, and today we're joined by a special guest, host of the Locked On Nittany Lions podcast, Zach Seyko. Zach, how's it going today, man?
Going good. I mean, we have plenty to talk about with the recent recruiting news, so let's have at it, right?
All right, yeah, let's jump right into it. Penn State lost their top commitment today in Alvin Henderson, number 36 overall in the country, number 3 running back overall in the country per Rivals. I just want to get your high-level thoughts on that. I know it's been rumored for a while now that Auburn was going to pull this one off.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is it's about time. I guess that Richie, everything that I heard along the way from the second that he was rumored to commit to Penn State to the time that he actually committed over the course of his commitment was that he's going to flip. It's that I feel like everybody and their brother said that Alvin Henderson is not going to stay committed to Penn State. You have a 0.001% chance of retaining him. So you might as well just, lose all hope, give up now. And that makes me wonder, why did Penn State take the commitment? Because if I know something like this, but the talent is there, right? That's why because Penn State's confident in themselves. They believe that, yes, we can land the commitment, we can hold the commitment, and he'd be a really good running back in our system. We need 3 running backs. So it made sense. But just there was really not a lot of positive talk from the Penn State side of things when it came to this recruitment and 1 month long, 2 month long commitment.
Yeah, 2 months long. It is. I mean, it's tough. Like Alvin Henderson is a stud. So one of the best, obviously, in the country, just based on ranking alone. If you watch his game tape, the man put up crazy numbers in Alabama. So it's hard to say no, I feel like, to a kid like that, especially if they want on board. But at the end of the day, like you mentioned, they kind of knew this was already going to happen. I mean, if we knew, they definitely knew.
Yeah.
So it is a tough one. The good news is they do still have Keandre Barker. They still do have T.Quay Hayes, both very good running backs in their own right. They are still pushing for another third running back, and they're actually going to have Jabri Wallace-Coleman on campus this weekend, which is a top 125 kid. So, I mean, that's a hell of a replacement, right?
And that's what Penn State is going to – Penn State, I feel like they've had this backup plan for a long time, actually. Jabri Wallace-Coleman was set to visit 2 weeks before. Then his official visit got moved to this weekend for this final round. And it's why is Penn State doing that? I've discussed this on my podcast. I've asked other recruiting experts like yourself about this. Why is Penn State having another high-end running back target up for an official visit when you have 3 very good commitments and what they believe, like they don't see a replacement for Keandre Barker. They don't see a replacement for T.Quay Hayes. Alvin Henderson, again, since he is a top 5 running back in his own right in the country, it's hard to find a replacement there. But then Jabri Wallace-Coleman, as you mentioned, is a top 125 player. So you already have these really good running backs, the 3 of them. There's no way you're going to get 4. So what gives? And now we see why Penn State had essentially hedging its recruiting bets, if you will. And Jabri Wallace-Coleman was committed to Georgia once upon a time. He's from the state of Pennsylvania. I just like the idea of having someone in proximity to Penn State committed rather than Alvin Henderson, who was always going to have that pressure from local schools, be it Auburn in this case, but Alabama was always there, Miami of Florida, schools that are closer to him. And Jabri Wallace-Coleman, I feel like this was just a long time coming. Why did he decommit from Georgia at the end of the day? Right?
It has to kind of just do with Fran Brown. That was their main recruiter down there. Obviously, Fran has really good ties to the Philly area, and there was some talk that Syracuse was going to be in it too. But end of the day,
it opened the door for Penn State.
Yeah, exactly. It almost makes you wonder too, because like Jabri Wallace-Coleman is a damn good back in his own right. Number one, number 2, he's not down the street, but he's close enough, like you mentioned. So why not just go for a guy like that originally?
I guess because Alvin Henderson came into the fold, I'm not entirely sure how that one works itself out. I feel like for the longest time, it was always going to be Jabri Wallace-Coleman, Hayes, and Barker. And Penn State's done a really good job at retaining because Hayes was rumored to go possibly take a visit, and Barker he's from Arkansas, had an Arkansas visit lined up. And Penn State is kind of able to convince him to say, hey, we want you to be 110% locked in. We don't want you taking any more visits. However that conversation went, whatever they said to him had Barker say, you know what, I'm good. My recruitment can be shut down. Kind of the same thing with Hayes, rumored to take a Stanford visit, then it gets canceled. He just decides not to do it. And Penn State, was able to secure those commitments. And then still, again, there's 2 running backs in this class. So the fact that Wallace Coleman or Henderson is even relatively interested in Penn State speaks a lot to the work that James Franklin, J1 Sider, and this entire recruiting staff have put in for this cycle, given that you assume they're going to lose both of Singleton and Allen to the NFL draft after this season.
I was going to say that bringing in 3 running backs is kind of crazy for any recruiting class, especially after you just brought 2 in the last cycle. You're still going to have a lot of different weapons on that team next year. And I know it's going to be a wide open running back room in terms of competition wise, at least. Yeah. But it just seems crazy to me to bring in 3 of them. And I'm surprised that all 3, honestly, are sticking at the moment. Or I should say 2 and potentially 3.
We are really being presumptuous here that Penn State is going, because North Carolina has been recruiting Jabri Wallace-Coleman. Like you said, had a really good relationship with Fran Brown, and that was one of the biggest reasons that he was committed to Georgia. So Syracuse at the end of the day could be an option if Wallace-Coleman looks at this situation and says, I think playing time would best suit me. Or is it staying closer to home? Is it playing in the Big Ten versus the ACC, right? And what's going to happen with the ACC? I think for Penn State, you have some security, even though you don't when it's a wide, right? You have security in the fact that it's still going to be the Big Ten conference. You're going to be playing the best of the best. Basically, it's the Big Ten and the SEC, and then everybody else. You don't know what's going to happen, and you could add more to the Big Ten. So Syracuse is kind of in that situation, but you also have more playing time. But you could look at it that way with Penn State, since if Singleton and Allen are going to move on, okay, it's Cam Wallace. I imagine Quentin Martin would be the first 2 guys up. But if you really enroll early, you could have a chance to at least get an opportunity for contributions right out of the gate as a true freshman. Look at Singleton and Allen. They played as true freshmen, and they played a lot down the stretch of their first years at Penn State. So who's to say any of them, Hayes, Wallace Coleman potentially, right? Barker could play their way into more playing time as true freshmen.
Yeah, and one more point I do want to bring up with all of this. We know Alvin Henderson's clearly NIL related a little bit. Whether the kid wants to admit it or not, most kids won't admit it publicly, but this is NIL related. And does this just speak more towards Penn State's issues with NIL?
I don't blame any player for taking NIL. Course, yeah. I think you and I have agreed. I've had you on, over on Locked On Nittany Lions. We've talked about it off the, personally between the 2 of us, that I personally will never blame a player for taking hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, whether some of that is upfront money, some of that is guaranteed. If you're promised or you work out an agreement with said school to make, somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, that is life-changing money, especially when you were 16, 17, 18 years old. Okay. The value of money is so much more different, but it's also just strategic. You don't know what's going to happen after football. You don't know on any. So I'm not saying, just take the money because, at the end of the day, you might not be as good as you think, or I don't even want to speak any other negative aspects that could happen into existence. But this game is unforgiving. We know that as reporters talking about this, discussing this, the players know it all the more so because they're actually doing it. The NFL is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. Yes, that's millions of dollars. That's the dream for a lot of players. So if it's anytime says, oh, it was NIL related, okay, Penn State's got to step up. If Penn State wants to compete in this space, they have to step up when it comes to NIL. I don't care what the excuse is at this point. This is the name of the game. So Penn State has to find a way to do that. They're an institution. I can't make excuses for them. They wouldn't have made it this far as a football program if they didn't figure it out before. So it's taken a little bit of time, but I think eventually they will, because Penn State's always been at or around the top 10.
Yeah, not even just the top 10, but they're honestly the premier program in the Northeast. And they have the alumni base. There's just, like you said, no more excuses anymore. Whether it be some are saying it's just the older generation just hates the idea of paying a player. they are also saying the older generation hates the idea that they're not honoring Joe Pa, and that's been a big excuse there. But they have the alumni base. They have the donor support. They just don't have the NIL support. And it's maddening to me because it's like, if you have that with James Franklin's recruiting abilities as is, this could be an all-time Penn State program going forward.
Everyone, at least in my YouTube comments or social media, you're not addressing the real problem. It's James Franklin at the end of the day. It has nothing to do with NIL. No, Penn State is where it is because of James Franklin, not in spite of him. And I don't think enough people realize that. How many of these things because James Franklin saw this new era of college football and where it was going and where it was trending. Okay. I'm not saying that any other coach would have figured it out, but James Franklin has been the one to fight a lot of battles. And it's like, oh, well, that's just his excuse list. I can't imagine how many other coaches would have succeeded in being able to stand up to the board of trustees. And I'm not saying that James Franklin or any other coach would have backed down, but these are battles within themselves. And I believe James Franklin, I believe any of them, and the writing is on the wall is there, that there was just never that much alignment between everybody that is trying to push Penn State football forward. Now you have a president that believes in it. That's important. The political side of it, the academic side, right? The institution of Penn State. And then Pat Kraft, who is wholeheartedly like, yes, football needs to be tops. It needs to be premier. And then James Franklin, who's saying, here's what we need. We need, facilities, better room and board, right? All these things that are just naturally competing against us, because you and I have said this before too on Locked On Nittany Lions. It is hard to convince a player from Miami Beach to come up to central Pennsylvania for a majority of his time. It's not just for football season, 3-4 months out of the year. It is almost annually, and that's far away from home. It's easier to convince a kid in Pennsylvania but the talent is not all in Pennsylvania. The difference, Joe Paterno dealt with regional recruiting, where it was, hey, focus on Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia. Now it's, you got to be able to recruit.
Well, some technical difficulties here, but sounds like we lost Zach, but you guys got the gist of it. Alvin Henderson has decommitted from Penn State. They've lost a 4-star running back, their third running back in the class. There's a good chance they will land Jabri Wallace-Coleman. He's on campus this weekend. We'll have more on that on pennstate.rivals.com. But for me and Zach, that's another episode of the Penn State 365 podcast. Signing off.